Denver rode into Culver's trading post on a Tuesday morning with a supply list, a buckboard wagon, and no idea that he would ride out with a wife. He was the richest rancher in 3 counties, and everyone knew it, which meant everyone wanted something from him, which meant he trusted almost no one. Inside that crooked door store, a Japanese woman knelt on the packed dirt floor with her hands bound, while a trader named Grissom bartered her away like a sack of flour. Denver had 3 choices, and the one he chose would bind 2 people across every cultural barrier between them and start a reckoning that would test whether honor speaks the same language on both sides of the Pacific. If you want to see how one sentence changed both their lives, stay until the very end and hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The territory road to Culver's trading post was packed dirt and wagon ruts, cutting through grassland that stretched flat and brown to the horizon. Denver drove the buckboard with one hand on the reins, his supply list folded in his shirt pocket where he could feel it against his chest. He had made this trip 100 times, and the familiarity of it settled into his bones like the creak of the wagon seat beneath him. The buckboard bounced over a rut, and the supplies shifted in the bed behind him, nails and fence wire and a new hammer for the south pasture. He was good at this, at the practical machinery of running a ranch. What he wasn't good at was people, and the trading post was full of them. Culver's sat at the crossroads of 2 territory roads about 15 miles south of Denver's ranch, a squat building with a crooked door that scraped the warped floorboards every time someone pushed through. It was the kind of place that existed because someone had been too tired to go any further, and over the years it had become the one-stop shop for every rancher and farmer within a day's ride. The shelves held flour and sugar and coffee, tack and ammunition and dry goods, everything a man needed to keep a household running, where the nearest real town was 60 miles north. Kerosene lanterns hung from the ceiling beams and threw a flickering amber light across the store. Denver stepped inside and let his eyes adjust. The clerk was a nervous man named Pruitt, who had worked the counter at Culver's for as long as Denver could remember. Pruitt looked up when the door scraped, and something in his face shifted when he saw Denver, a flicker of relief mixed with something Denver couldn't read. Denver set his supply list on the counter, and Pruitt grabbed it like a lifeline, scanning the items with eyes that kept darting toward the back room. Denver noticed the way Pruitt's fingers trembled on the paper, the way his breathing came too fast, the way he kept swallowing like his throat was tight. Denver had spent 30 years reading the body language of horses and men who were afraid. Pruitt was afraid of something behind that back door. Denver set a hand on the counter and leaned forward. He didn't ask what was wrong, because asking gave a man the chance to lie. He started gathering his supplies from the shelves, moving through the store with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew where everything was. Pruitt fumbled behind the counter, pulling tack from the back shelves, his movements jerky and graceless. The amber light from the lanterns caught the sweat on Pruitt's forehead. Whatever was behind that door, it had the clerk so spooked he could barely function. Then Denver heard it. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of one. A silence so deliberate it pressed against the walls. Someone behind that back door was being very quiet. The kind of quiet a person learns when they have discovered that making noise costs more than it's worth. Denver set his canvas sack on the counter and looked at Pruitt, who had gone still with a box of cartridges half pulled from the shelf. Their eyes met, and Pruitt's face said everything his mouth wouldn't. Denver pushed through the back room door without knocking, because knocking gave people time to hide things. The room was smaller than the store, lit by a single kerosene lantern that threw amber light across a floor of packed dirt and shelves stacked with feed sacks and kegs of nails. The air smelled like grain dust and something sharp and medicinal that Denver couldn't place. A green scent that didn't belong in a trading post. A woman knelt on the packed dirt floor near the back wall. Her hands were bound in front of her with rough rope, the kind used for tying bales, and the cord had cut into her wrists enough to leave raw, pink lines against her fair skin. Her hair was jet black and pinned in a traditional Japanese knot at the back of her head, every strand in place despite everything, as though the knot itself were a refusal to come undone. She wore a kimono beneath a dust-coated trail coat, the silk visible at the collar and wrists, a deep blue so out of place in this rough frontier room that it looked like a piece of another world had been dropped into the wrong story. Her face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, a narrow jaw, and eyes so dark they looked black in the lantern light, almond-shaped and fixed on a point on the floor ahead of her knees. She didn't look up when the door opened. The trader stood over her. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a red face and a beard that needed trimming, and the kind of confidence that comes from believing the law will never reach this far. Denver knew his name was Grissom, had heard it mentioned in town the way people talk about something unpleasant they cannot avoid. Two other men stood near the shelves, rough-looking characters with the posture of men who followed orders for money. One of them held a length of rope coiled in his hand. Grissom was talking when Denver came through the door, mid-sentence, his voice loud and easy in the way men get when they believe they own the room. He was bartering with the two men, naming a price, gesturing at the woman with the casual wave of a hand showing off a horse. The words he used were the words men use for livestock, for things that don't have names worth remembering. Denver stood in the doorway and listened to 3 sentences of it before his jaw set hard enough to ache. The woman on the floor hadn't moved. She knelt with her back straight and her bound hands resting on her knees, one hand on top of the other hidden beneath the folds of her coat. Her stillness was not the stillness of fear or submission, because Denver had seen both, and this was neither. It was the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome. A stillness so complete it made Grissom's loud performance look like what it was. A man trying to convince himself he was in control of something he didn't understand. Denver had seen cruelty on the frontier, had watched men do things to each other that he couldn't reconcile with the idea that people were supposed to be better than this. He had walked away from some of it and lived with the weight of both. But something about the precision of this woman's silence stopped him in a way he could not have explained. She was not performing dignity for an audience. She was holding on to it because it was the last thing she had, and she wasn't going to let Grissom take it the way he had taken everything else. Grissom noticed Denver and his voice cut off mid-word. The two men by the shelves turned, and the one with the rope shifted his weight. Grissom's face went through a quick sequence: surprise, annoyance, and then the calculated smile of a man deciding how to handle an unexpected problem. He told Denver the back room was closed for private business and suggested he take his supplies and head home. His voice carried the careful edge of a man making threats he wants to be able to deny later. Denver didn't respond. He was watching the woman, trying to read something in the angle of her head, the set of her shoulders. She hadn't looked up, and Denver understood that too. Looking up was an act of hope, and she had decided that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Denver had 3 choices, and he knew what they were because he had been in this position before, standing on the edge of someone else's disaster and deciding how much of it he was willing to make his own. He could walk out the way he came, buy his supplies, and drive the buckboard home before supper time. Nobody in this territory would blame him for it, because that was what everyone else did. He could ride for the sheriff, which meant 2 days of travel to find a man who might or might not care, and who would arrive to find the woman gone and Grissom's story already rehearsed. Or he could do something that would mark him as a fool forever. Something that a man with his land and his money and his reputation had no practical reason to do. He looked at the room. Grissom had 2 men with him, and all 3 were armed. Denver carried a revolver on his hip, but a gunfight in a trading post back room over a woman he had never met would be reckless and might get her hurt. He could buy her, pull cash from his pocket, and pay Grissom's price. But buying her would make her a transaction, would validate exactly what Grissom was doing, would turn her into a receipt instead of a person. Denver's money was the thing he was best at, and in this moment it was the thing he could least afford to use. Denver crossed the room. He didn't rush, because rushing looked like desperation, and desperation invited challenge. He moved past the shelves, past Grissom's 2 men, past Grissom himself, and stopped directly in front of the woman on the floor. He looked down at her, and she looked up at him for the first time. What passed between them was not love or trust or any of the words people use for the moment two lives intersect. It was a recognition, something quieter and more permanent, the look two people exchange when they have both learned what it means to stand alone against forces stronger than themselves and have neither of them broken. Denver turned to Grissom and spoke 3 words. "That's my wife." The room went silent, the kind of silence that lands like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward until it touches every wall. Grissom's smile froze on his face, stuck between the expression he had been wearing and the one trying to replace it. The 2 men by the shelves looked at each other, then at Grissom, then back at Denver. This wasn't what they had expected, and none of them had a script for it. Grissom recovered first, because men like Grissom always recover first. He asked Denver how long he had been married to a woman he had clearly never seen before. Denver didn't flinch. He described her with the specific ease of a husband who knows his wife's habits, pulling details from what he could see and inventing the rest with the confidence of a man who has been bluffing his whole life. He said her hair was always up like that, said she didn't talk much, said she had come from the coast and he had sent her ahead to wait for him. Every word was a lie, and every word landed with the weight of truth, because Denver delivered it with the flat certainty of a man who has never had to raise his voice to be believed. Then he said her name, Himari. The word came out of his mouth before he knew he was going to say it, and he couldn't have explained where it came from. It wasn't a name he had heard or read or could connect to anything in his memory. It simply arrived, as though the woman on the floor had placed it in the room and Denver had picked it up without thinking. She looked at him when he said it, and something moved behind her eyes, a flicker so brief that only someone standing as close as Denver was standing could have caught it. Grissom didn't believe him. That was obvious in the way his eyes narrowed and his jaw worked, the calculations running behind his face. But he couldn't disprove it either, and Denver's reputation was the kind of thing that made men hesitate before calling him a liar to his face. Denver was the richest rancher in 3 counties, and nobody in this territory wanted to cross him over a woman they didn't care about. Grissom's 2 men cared even less, because they were paid by the day, and this was turning into something that would cost more days than it was worth. Grissom backed down, but not cleanly. He told Denver that a man who claims a wife he cannot produce a certificate for is asking for trouble in a territory where paper is the only thing that outweighs a gun. He said he knew where Denver's ranch was, because everyone did, and he said it with the careful emphasis of a man leaving a door open for himself. Then he walked out with his 2 men behind him, and the silence they left behind was heavier and shaped like a threat that hadn't finished landing. Denver pulled a knife from his belt and cut the rope binding Himari's wrists. The cord fell away in 2 pieces, and she brought her hands together slowly, pressing her palms flat against each other. She didn't thank him. She didn't cry. She stood, collected a small lacquered box from the floor beside where she had been kneeling, and met his eyes. The box was dark wood, no bigger than a boot, sealed with a brass clasp, and she held it against her ribs the way a soldier holds a rifle. Denver didn't know what was inside it. He would learn that later. Denver loaded his supplies onto the buckboard in silence, stacking the canvas sacks beside the fence wire and the new hammer. Himari stood beside the wagon with her lacquered box held against her chest, watching him work with the same stillness she had maintained on the floor of the trading post. He offered her a hand up onto the wooden seat, and she looked at his palm for a long moment before taking it, her grip firm and brief. Denver climbed up on the other side, gathered the reins, and turned the buckboard onto the territory road heading north. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. The silence wasn't hostile, and it wasn't the awkward silence of strangers who don't know what to say. It was the silence of 2 people who had both survived something and hadn't yet decided whether the other was safe. Denver drove with his eyes on the road and his thoughts running in circles, trying to figure out what he had just done and what it was going to cost him. He was good at cattle and bad at people, and what he had just done was a people problem problem of the highest order. Himari broke the silence first. She spoke English carefully, with the precision of someone who had learned it as a second language and placed each word the way a carpenter places a nail. She asked him one question. She asked why he had done that. Not accusatory, not grateful, but genuinely asked, like she actually expected him to have an answer. Denver drove in silence for a few more yards before he replied, because he didn't have a good answer. He told her he couldn't walk away from it. He said it flat, without dressing it up, and she studied his face the way someone reads a contract, looking for the hidden terms. Then she nodded once, a small movement that barely shifted her weight on the seat, and looked back at the road. She told him her story in pieces over the next 10 miles, each piece short and precise, placed like a stone in a wall. She came from Kyoto, where her family had practiced Kampo, the traditional medicine of Japan, for 4 generations. Her grandmother trained her in herbs and needles, and her mother trained her in remedies, and she was preparing to take over the family practice when the Meiji government decided the old ways were backwards and Japan needed Western doctors. The government shut down the traditional schools and stripped the old practitioners of their licenses. Himari watched her family's work get erased in the space of a few years, and when the last patients stopped coming, she took her grandmother's medicine box and crossed the ocean. She arrived in San Francisco with the box and nothing else, and she hadn't been on American soil for a week before the people who were supposed to help her sold her to the first trader who made an offer. From there, she was moved inland, passed from one set of hands to another, each transaction cheaper than the last, until she ended up kneeling on the packed dirt of Culver's trading post. She told Denver this in the same flat, precise voice she had used to ask him why, without self-pity and without drama. Denver listened without interrupting, because what she was giving him was not a confession, but an inventory. A list of facts that explained how a woman trained in medicine had ended up bound on the floor of a frontier store. Denver processed this the way he processed everything, slowly and through his body before his mind caught up. His grip on the reins loosened, his jaw unclenched. He shifted his weight on the seat to give her more room without being asked. He didn't offer sympathy because sympathy from a stranger who had just claimed her as his wife would have sounded like a transaction of a different kind. He simply drove, and the buckboard rolled north through the grassland, and the sun moved across the sky. By the time the ranch appeared on the horizon, a cluster of buildings and fencing and cattle grazing on good grass, they had spoken maybe 40 sentences between them. It wasn't a conversation that had solved anything, but something had shifted in the space between them on that seat. Not trust exactly, and not yet, but the beginning of a structure that might hold trust later if neither of them knocked it down. Denver looked at the ranch coming toward them and thought about the empty house at the end of the drive. For the first time in years, the emptiness felt like something other than a fact he carried. It felt like a question. The ranch spread across a wide valley with the main house sitting on a rise that overlooked the cattle runs and the barn and the bunkhouse. Denver's wealth was visible in the quality of everything. The fences straight and tight, the barn solid and freshly painted, the cattle fat on good grass. But the house itself was spare and functional, a 2-room structure with a plank floor and a cast iron stove, and furniture built for durability rather than comfort. It was a house built for work, for a man who ate and slept and went back to work. Himari stepped through the front door and took in the space without comment. She moved through the rooms with a stillness that was almost clinical, her dark eyes cataloging the stove, the table, the shelf with its few plates. Then she set her lacquered box on the kitchen table, and the sound of it landing on the wood was small but definite. The first object in this house that looked like it belonged to a person rather than an operation. Denver watched her do it from the doorway and felt something shift in the room, a change he couldn't name if someone had put a gun to his head. He showed her the back room, though he didn't call it anything. He just opened the door to the small room with its narrow bed and its window and its rough wool blanket, and he nodded toward it. Himari looked at the bed, looked at the window where the last of the daylight was coming through, and bowed her head once. Not submission, acknowledgement. the way a person accepts a fact and moves on to the next one. He made coffee on the cast iron stove, filling the pot from the water bucket and setting it on the hottest part of the iron. The kerosene lanterns on the walls threw their amber light across the kitchen, the flicker making the shadows move like something breathing. Denver poured 2 cups and set one in front of Himari at the table. She wrapped both hands around it, not to drink but to warm her fingers, and in the lantern light he could see the raw pink lines on her wrists where the rope had been. He didn't mention it. He sat down across from her and drank his coffee. They ate beans and bread in near silence, and he watched her eat the way someone watches a person who has learned that food can be taken away. Small bites, steady pace, nothing wasted, the efficiency of someone who had spent long enough without enough that the habit of scarcity had become part of her body. Denver didn't comment on this either. But he made a second pot of coffee after the first was gone and set it on the stove to keep warm without being asked. And when she finally raised the cup to her lips, he poured fresh coffee into it without a word. That night, Denver lay awake in his room across the hall, staring at the ceiling while the house settled around him. He heard her move once, the sound of a door opening and closing, and then nothing. He thought about Grissom's threat, about the fact that he now had a wife he couldn't send back, and a lie that was growing roots in the soil of his life. He didn't think about whether it was the right choice, because that question was behind him now. What mattered was what came next, and what came next was a morning he couldn't see from where he was lying. The next morning brought the first test, though neither of them would have called it that. One of Denver's ranch hands rode in from the south pasture shortly after dawn, with his arm wrapped in a filthy rag and his face the color of old tallow. The wound was on his forearm, a gash from a fence wire that had gone 3 days without proper cleaning. The skin around it was swollen and hot, the edges turned an angry red shading toward purple. This was the sort of infection that killed men on the frontier, not fast but slow, the way a fever climbs until the body cannot climb back down. Denver told the hand to sit and wait, that he would ride for the doctor in town. But even as Denver reached for his hat, Himari was already moving. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and opened the lacquered box on the table. Inside were things Denver had never seen. Rows of needles so fine they caught no light, laid in a groove along the lid. Packets of dried herbs wrapped in paper, each labeled with characters he couldn't read. A smooth black stone that fit in the palm of her hand. A small bottle of something that smelled sharp and green, the same scent he had caught in the back room of the trading post. She didn't ask permission. She didn't explain what she was about to do. She took the hand's arm with both of her own, turned it to examine the wound, and began. Denver watched from the doorway as she cleaned the cut with the solution from the bottle, her movements precise and unhurried. The hand flinched once at the sting and then held still, because the steadiness of her hands gave him no reason to expect anything worse. She selected 3 needles from the box and pressed them into points along the forearm, and Denver watched the hand's face change as each needle went in. He expected pain. What he felt instead was a warmth spreading from the needles, and then a dulling of the pain that he couldn't explain. His face went from braced to confused to something approaching wonder. Denver watched her work and understood something he had not been able to understand before this moment. She was not helpless, not a charity case, not a nameless piece of cargo. She was the most competent person he had ever seen in a room, and she had been bound and bartered by every person who had looked at her since she arrived in this country. The distance between what she was and what she had been treated as hit him like a physical thing, a tightness in his chest that he breathed through and didn't name. She bound the wound with cloth torn from her own trail coat and mixed a paste from 2 of the herb packets, spreading it over the bandage with a flat wooden tool. Then she told the hand to keep it dry and come back in 2 days, and her English was careful and precise and left no room for argument. By evening, the swelling had receded enough that he could move his fingers. The word spread among the hands by morning. Denver has a wife, and his wife can heal things the doctor cannot. 2 weeks passed, and Himari settled into the ranch the way water settles into a new channel, not by force, but by the slow, persistent act of finding where it fits. She tended a garden behind the house, turning a patch of hard dirt into rows of green shoots that smelled like the contents of her medicine box. She treated the hand's minor ailments, burns and sprains and the cough that had been working through the bunkhouse all spring. She cooked meals that tasted like nothing Denver had eaten in 30 years of frontier cooking, subtle and layered with flavors he had no names for. She didn't fill the silence with chatter. She filled it with purpose, and the difference between those two things was the difference between a house that was occupied and a house that was alive. Denver noticed the house changing around him, not dramatically, but in small accretions that accumulated like sediment. A cloth on the table that hadn't been there before, a piece of deep blue fabric that might have been part of her kimono, herbs drying in the kitchen window, tied in bundles with string, the faint smell of something sharp and clean that lingered after she passed through a room. He didn't comment on any of it, but he stopped eating alone, came to the table at the same time every evening, and sat across from her in the amber lantern light while they ate in a silence that was beginning to feel less like an accident and more like a habit they had chosen. Then Grissom arrived. He didn't come with guns or with the two men from the trading post. He came with a piece of paper, riding up to the ranch house on a Monday morning, looking like a man holding a winning hand he had spent 2 weeks arranging. He dismounted in the yard, walked to the porch, and knocked on the door. When Denver opened it, Grissom held out a document with the careful presentation of a man showing a card he knows beats whatever is on the table. It was a debt document, a promissory note claiming that a woman, described only as one Japanese female, had been sold to Grissom for $60. The paper was fake. Denver could see that in the crude handwriting and the smudged ink, but it looked real enough. In a territory where the nearest judge was a week's ride away and the sheriff could be bought with a bottle, paper carried weight that truth didn't. Grissom named his price and said he didn't want trouble. He said he just wanted what he had paid for, and the way he said what instead of who told Denver everything. Denver took the paper and read it standing on his own porch. It was a crude forgery, the kind that wouldn't survive 5 minutes in a real courtroom, but didn't need to, because there was no real courtroom here. Only a sheriff who owed Grissom favors, and a territorial court that convened once a month. His jaw tightened as he read, and he looked past the paper at Grissom's face, which was wearing the same calculated smile from the trading post. Himari appeared in the doorway behind Denver. She didn't speak. She stood with her back straight and her hands at her sides, and Grissom's smile faltered when he saw her, not because she threatened him, but because her stillness made his performance look cheap. She was standing in her own doorway in her own home, and the document in Grissom's hand was trying to say she didn't have one. Denver told Grissom to leave. Grissom didn't leave. He mentioned the sheriff, a man he had been buying drinks for 3 weeks. He mentioned the territorial court, which would convene in 6 days, and didn't look kindly on men who stole property from honest traders. He used the word property, and he used it while looking directly at Himari. Grissom gave Denver until morning to decide. Pay the price on the paper, or he would ride to the sheriff and have Himari legally seized. He was confident because the paper, however fake, was the only document in this territory that mentioned her at all. Denver had no marriage certificate, no bill of sale, no legal proof that Himari was his wife. His lie had no paper behind it, and in a territory where paper outweighed truth, that was the one thing he couldn't bluff his way past. Denver sent his best hand riding for the territorial judge that afternoon, a man named Harlan, who was the closest thing to honest authority in 100 miles. But Harlan was 5 days away, and Grissom was giving Denver until morning. 5 days was 4 days and a night too long. Denver watched the hand ride out and felt the distance open up between him and the one thing that might settle this. That evening, Grissom rode away with his threat hanging in the air, and Denver and Himari sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the kerosene lantern flickering between them. He told her about the document, about Grissom's ultimatum, about the sheriff who could be bought. He told her that his word against a piece of paper might not be enough, because in this territory, a lie without a document behind it was just a story, and stories didn't stop a sheriff from taking a woman off a porch. Himari listened without moving, her dark eyes watching Denver's face with the same careful attention she gave to a wound she was examining. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she opened the lacquered box that sat on the table between them and took out something Denver hadn't seen before. A folded paper tucked into the lid behind the row of needles, pressed flat against the wood. She unfolded it and set it on the table. It was a letter of introduction from a Kyoto medical school, written in Japanese and English, stamped with a red seal that caught the lantern light. The English text identified Himari as a licensed practitioner of Kampo medicine, a graduate of an institution that had trained healers for 4 centuries. It bore the signature of the school's director and the date of her certification. It was not a marriage document. It was something better. Proof that she was not property, that she was a person with credentials that predated Grissom's crude forgery by years, that she had existed as someone of standing in her own country before anyone in this territory decided she was something that could be bought. Denver looked at the seal, the careful English handwriting, the date older than the territory itself. His face changed. He had been protecting her since the moment he knelt beside her on that floor. She had been carrying her own weapon the entire time, folded into the lid of a box she held against her ribs like armor. She hadn't needed him to save her. She had needed him to give her the ground to stand on, and she had done the rest herself. The next morning, Denver met Grissom on the porch with the letter in his hand. He didn't shout, because shouting was what men did when they didn't have the facts. He showed Grissom the seal, the English text, the credentials from an institution older than any building in this territory. He told Grissom that if he wanted to take this to a territorial court, he was welcome to try, because a woman with a medical license from a Kyoto institution was not property, and the judge would take one look at Grissom's smudged forgery and know exactly what it was. Grissom read the letter twice. His smile died somewhere between the first reading and the second, the confidence draining out of his face until what was left was the expression of a man who has run out of moves. He looked at Denver, then at Himari standing in the doorway, then back at the paper. He folded it carefully, handed it back, and walked to his horse. He mounted, turned south, and rode away with the dust rising behind him. He didn't come back. The ranch settled into a rhythm that neither of them had planned, but that both of them stopped questioning. Himari treated the hands and the neighboring families who rode in after word of her skills spread across the valley. She treated them with the same quiet competence she had shown on that first morning, opening the lacquered box, selecting her tools, working in a silence that the people she healed didn't interrupt. Denver ran the cattle and fixed the fences and managed the land, and in the evenings he came home to a house that smelled like herbs and something cooking on the stove that wasn't beans. The wall came down on a rainy evening, because moments like these don't announce themselves. Denver came home late, soaked and exhausted from a day of chasing cattle through a broken fence in a storm. He pushed through the door and found Himari waiting at the table with a cup of coffee already poured, the steam rising in the amber lantern light. She didn't say anything. She just pushed the cup toward him across the table. He sat down, drank it, and felt the warmth spread through his chest. For the first time since she arrived, the silence between them felt like home instead of an accident they were both still recovering from. They never had a conversation about whether the marriage was real, because some things do not survive being said out loud. What passes between them is not love, not yet, and maybe not for a long time. but it's a recognition that has deepened into something neither of them has a word for. A partnership built on the fact that when everything was falling apart, neither of them walked away. Denver thinks about the three choices he had in that trading post: walk away, report it, or do something foolish. He chose the foolish thing, and the foolish thing became the only real thing in his life. Himari's lacquered box still sits on the kitchen table where she placed it that first night. The needles inside have healed a dozen hands and a dozen neighbors by now. Denver still calls her his wife, and neither of them has decided yet whether that word is a lie that became true or a truth that started as a lie. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels.